What I'm interested in is the emotion in epigrams and the emotional response or the emotional aspects in reader response in epigrams. You can see that the concept of empathy will be central for me, but it is not only empathy, it is also the contrary of empathy, which is perhaps, for which the right term is perhaps a dissociation, or I'd call it now the other emotions or the contrary of empathy. There is certainly a risk you take if you abort the theme of emotions. It is the risk of subjectivity or impressionism in your interpretation. And that's why all critics of the new criticism called this the affective fallacy of this mode of interpretation. You have to beware of. It means that emotions are not necessarily the emotions of the ancients. What we feel when reading an epigram is not necessarily what the ancient felt when reading. Our response is not the same, and even the vocabulary is not the same. Nevertheless, I felt encouraged by recent studies on emotional history or historische Emotionsforschung, such as the book by Angelos Chaniotis, Unveiling Emotions in 2012, or Torsten Vögen, Tears in Ancient Greco-Roman Antiquity in 2009 appeared. And there's also a Berlin group of Latinists who work on this. Or the book of Sanders and Tumiga, published even this year, in which I found a nice article of Maria Canello on metaphors. So to all of these I owe much for my approach. For the questions concerning emotions in general in antiquity and in ancient philosophy and theory, I owe much to the book you all know of David Constan, The Emotions of the Ancient Greeks of 2007, and also to the excellent commentary of Christoph Rapp on the Rhetoric of Aristotle, which is a very important but very difficult text, which would have rested more mysterious for me without the work of Christoph Rapp, which I can really recommend. Although erotic epigrams seems to be the most emotional epigrams or emotional epigram par excellence to study feelings and emotions, I will focus here on other epigram types because for erotic epigram there is a lot of work actually done by Catherine Gutzwiller, by David Constan, or by Maria Canello and others. Just one remark, it was just the studies on erotic epigram who pushed me a little bit to work on this theme, because it's not really, there are lots of publications which are not really satisfying, and it's fascinating to follow the history of interpretation by modern scholars on the theme of emotions. For example, there is in Germany, in German tradition, a classic article by Georg Luck on Witz und Sentiment in epigram, which is full of prejudices and German classicism a la Winkelmann, etc. So it would be fascinating to follow this. In the suite, there is Daniel Garrison, Mild Frenzy, a very important book, who relativize, who critics already, and there are modern critics on our attitudes on the emotions, on erotic emotions especially. But this will not be my theme, or only marginally. So my question was, what can we learn from the new approaches of emotional history or historische Emotionsforschung for the origin and the evolution of literary epigram? I will give you some, in my PowerPoint, some preliminary remarks, and after that some examples. So some premises from Chaniotis and others, and my own reflections. Epigrams are emotive texts. His contribution is called Moving Stones. It is one of the functions of non-literary and of literary epigram to take part in a sort of performance or enactment of emotions. Joseph Day calls this a ritual which has been done. It is to enact emotions and to provoke, to elicit the emotions of a reader. This is a part of the structure of persuasion which is typical for all epigrams. But there are also literary social functions which are stressed by the historians. This is a function of what is called social sharing or emotional communities, which can be the communities of the polis, which can be in a Panhellenic perspective, or also the community of the emotions of one group of people, the aristocratic elite, the intellectuals who often make fun of popular emotions. So this is very important. Also in literary epigram of the 3rd century, to my mind, this plays a role. So when emotion is already there in inscriptional epigram, but when epigrams become literature or book epigrams, what happens then? We can find some new literary techniques who come into play to control the emotional response of the reader who's no more in front of the inscription. There is a new interest in the inner states of the individual. All sorts of expressions are interesting the poets and the philosophers, especially the complex and the universal emotions which are shared by tout le monde. There's, for example, in the article of David Constan on Meleager, he shows, and Catherine Gutzwiller also show, that Meleager is not encyclopedia of all with the same emotion, eros, but that there is movement, evolution, and there's complexity in this emotion. Also, we can say on the level of literary history that there are new combinations of what I call genre-based emotions which appear. For example, there are typical emotions, stereotyped emotions of readers of funerary epigrams, which merge with epic emotions or heroic emotions, or the emotions which are typically displayed by archaic lyric. If you think, for example, of the role of Sappho in epigram, which becomes an icon of what is emotion in poetic texts. There's a new strategy. What is important also, emotional identification or empathy becomes important in order to the more distant or now more distant bookish reader, to appeal to empathy, sympathy, and all what is with this identity on the emotional level. For this and other concepts, the intellectual elite of the beginning of the 3rd century already, the epigram poets, could base on the theory of Aristotle and the philosophic schools, who continued to discuss what is emotion, definitions of emotions, what is generic, what is specific in emotion, with its examples, and it was not only Aristotle, but it continues in other schools. Philosophers also discussed the emotional aspects of poetic language and of the generation of pleasure in poetic texts. And this is important for us because it makes the link between the emotions which are represented, described in text, and the emotions which act on readers and public. It is poetic language which is central here. As a result of the whole evolution of literary epigram, the performance of emotions in literary epigrams become often very rhetorical. We think there's no true emotion in this, it's rhetoric. And they become literary by the play of intertextuality, which means there is an emotion which seems to be an emotion typical of Sappho, but it's in the same time it's epigram, and at the same time it's Homer. So it's more and more literal and more complex. One of the consequences of this evolution is the humorous prise de distance or dissociation of poets. I think it's on the origin of humor in epigram, humor which is typical for literary epigram. There may be other reasons, not only the humor or the dissociation, but there may be other reasons for the phenomenon which historians of ancient art call Pathosdämpfung. It's the not holy, but already fast holy suppression of emotion, Pathosdämpfung. This is the influence of philosophy and especially of Stoicism or Scepticism. By this is my thesis, the intellectual elite dissociates itself from popular emotions which are displayed in religion or from the aesthetic response to works of art by popular people, so the vulgar emotions in some way. So this was the preliminary remarks. I come to some examples. I will start with the topos of the invitation to mourn, which we know from inscriptional epigrams, the invitation to mourn, to perform a ritual. This topos is deconstructed, as you all know, in the Timon epigrams, Timon the misanthrope, and this is my first example of Hegesippos in the 3rd century, who addresses the reader, but who says, you may feel pity and perform your ritual, be emotional, but I'm not interested in that, go away. So this is a deconstruction of this emotional reaction. We have a comparable thing in Lucilius in the 1st century after Christ. The epigram, which is also well known, on a poet, a poetess, a bad poet, who constructed a monument only to inscribe a one-line funerary epigram, and he did it for his own glory, as epidexin. This is a critic of these rhetorical, vain poetasters. What is interesting in this epigram is the use of a verb, and this verb is kleien, klauserte. It means weep, cry, weep. In stone epigrams, which I saw in CEG and when I was checking, kleien it's more the reaction of the family members who bury someone, or it's the friend, the philoi, but it's not the anonymous passerby who weeps. So this is the first thing which is a little bit exaggerated in this epigram. Then, as the American commentator Nystrom remarked, klauserte kleien can also mean suffer peril or go to the devil. So there is a jeu de mots, a joke here. But I think there is a third point, and that is the pathetic reaction of the reader, because this poetaster, he is a rhetorician. What he makes is epidexis. And you know that the greatest thing for an orator, for a speaker, is to make the public cry. So I think this is also a meaning in this text, and it's a critique of Lucilius, who exaggerates a little bit these emotions. A critique of rhetoric in epigram, or rhetoric in poetasters. And the final joke is certainly that you have to cry more about this vain poetaster, but not on the deceased Maximus, who doesn't exist. So, David Constant and others often draw our attention to a sort of emotional turn which occurs in Hellenistic times, which means that the emotion becomes an interior domain, not controlled by society, but an interior domain, separate, hidden, and that we have to interpret signs in people to detect their emotions. But if you read the rhetoric of Aristotle, you can already see that he talks of signs of emotions in narrative texts, gestures, expressions of people, and already if you see these signs you feel emotion. The reader feels emotions. You don't need a description. You don't need an agia. Sign is sufficient to provoke reactions of readers. I think this is very important for the function of literary text and also of epigrams. A well-known example for the interpretation of signs on the level of the text is the epigram of the Kleonikos epigram of Callimachus, where Callimachus interprets signs of a strong emotion in Kleonikos. It's eros, but it also illness and death, signs of eros, illness and death. And it's a very empathic epigram. He feels also empathy. This is expressed by the emotional vocabulary, talan, and all this, with a little bit of humor, but it's a sort of empathy. So the reaction here, I want to make a little comparison. It is a reaction to the physical signs of a person, and the person is described like a skeleton. It's all only bones and all in some way dead. You can think on the epigram of Poseidippos on the bronze statue of the skeleton, which will also provoke a strong emotional reaction in readers and viewers. So empathy is a theme, and it's a major theme in epigrams on shipwrecked persons. The ethical aspect, this shows also an ethical aspect of emotions. We have I have two examples, my next examples of Callimachus and Poseidippos. There is a person who finds a dead shipwrecked and who buries him as a service for the dead. And why does he do it? He does it because he feels his own life is very comparable to the life of the deceased. This is empathy. So empathy is a motivation to do things as says Aristotle. There is an ethical aspect in this. It's the mot-clé in Callimachus is bios. We compare our own bios to the bios of the deceased. And another mot-clé, a key term, is hesychon. So we are in the discourse also of perhaps of hesychia, of Stoic or other philosophical, very common ideas of the quiet soul. The same thing happens a little bit in Poseidippos. I think you can take these epigrams also of examples for the construction of emotional communities, because we all are, the immigrants in Alexandria at least, are potentially shipwrecked persons. We are travel, we are immigrants, so it's a universal experience. But perhaps not so universal like that. Perhaps it's more restrained to a group. My next example is, it's the example of public emotions. So it's another type of emotions which can be universal, or yes, you have to see. I will start with Poseidippos and the funerary epigram for Hedaya. It's a dark cloud. He says a dark cloud comes over the city when Aetion buries his daughter. The whole town joined in sympathetic grief. And in the end, he stops this public grief for the reasons why we will see. What is interesting here is the use of a metaphor, the black cloud, which is very known from Homer, where it is not a metaphor, but it is part of the narrative. A black cloud means that a god arrives to save someone, to kidnap a warrior who is in danger and to save him from death in a dark cloud. So the god is hidden and the warrior is hidden and the warrior is saved. He stays alive. The contrary happens here in Poseidippos. First, it is not a warrior, it's a daughter. Second, she is not saved. There's the motive of the marriage with Hades, which is variated here. She's not really saved, but she is kidnapped by Hymenaios, by the Hymenaios of death. There also is, so it's another metaphor. So the reason why Poseidippos, oh no, I wanted to say, sorry, the Homeric color, the epic heroic male warrior color, is used very intelligently by Simonides, who I had pseudo-Simonides in an epigram, a typical Kleos epigram, which you have on your handout, where he says, Kyaneon nephos is something which comes when the deceased warriors are not really deceased. This is in the Homeric idea, and this is very classic. So this is Simonides. Where we are in the public sphere of emotions and in the stereotype. But I think it's also interesting to compare Poseidippos to Archilochos, to a fragment of Archilochos, for what is the end of the epigram, and the end is stopping now the lament, stopping the mourning. Archilochos addresses to his group in the polis, and he stresses very extremely the aspect of the public mourning and of public acceptance. The polis accepts that we lament, but we have to stop now and to control ourselves. I think it's very a different thing which happens in Poseidippos with the sympathetic griefs. The speaker says we have to stop it, but there's no reason given. It's only the end of sympathy. But it's not social control which plays a role here. Which I said something on sympathy, on social control of emotions, which are another thing in literary epigrams. And I think it is also interesting to compare the use of the metaphors. And there also Aristotle can help with his remarks on poetic language and on the functions of metaphors. If we look on the Kyaneonephos in Poseidippos, I think it is not only the heroic color which is at which he aims here. It's not only the play with Homer and other models, but Kyaneonephos, it means the presence of the god, but it means also it's a metaphor for the grief. I think it has become a metaphor for the grief. The dark cloud comes into the town. It's not only the presence of the god, but it is the grief which come here. And that would be a new interpretation of this metaphor. It would be an emotional interpretation. So when we think on Aristotle, what he says of metaphors, we can see some remarks of modern critics like David Meyer, who have studied the emotional reactions of modern readers and who have the category of aesthetic feelings or artifact emotions if a metaphor is very telling or very good, very réussi. And I think this is one new function of metaphor we can perhaps see here. Metaphor, it is a brilliant new application, and what Aristotle would say, metaphor invite to interpretation and to comparison, because it is a little bit surprising to find it here. My last example is, I will come back to the use of poetic language and of certain verbs of emotion. And this verb is, again, kleien or klauserte. I said in the beginning for Lucilius that kleien is very strong. It's the reaction of people who are really concerned, so the family and the philoi. If you look in the collection of Carmina Epigraphica Graeca, you find it always in this context and not very often. It's not very often used. If you make a search on the, perhaps it will be another thing in the new collection of Hellenistic Carmina Epigraphica which are inscribed, but I didn't have made all the researches yet. But in CEG, it's rare. And you don't find, even in Anthologia Palatina, you don't find the imperative, you don't find Klauserte. Klauserte is only Lucilius, which is a play, and this second example is Gregory of Nazianz in the 4th century after Christ. There is a little series of epigrams of Gregory, which you have on your handout, which talk of the nature, which is weeping on the death of a person. This is the typical motive of pathetic fallacy. The inanimate object, the whole nature weeps on the death of a person, which you know from Theocritus and the bucolic tradition. Theocritus I, and also on the epitaphios on Adonis, and in the bucolic tradition you find this pathetic fallacy. These 3 epigrams are variations of this topos. In the first epigram, it's nature which weeps on a dead person. In the second, it's nature which weeps on someone who destructed the tomb. This is also a known motive, the defiler of graves, so I don't know the term. Someone who destructs a tomb is punished, and he is punished by nature, who will throw all the stones on him and cause his death. So a second variation with also an echo effect. The third one is encore longer. It's not nature, but it's an artificial garden, a paradise-like garden who weeps over the death of the dedicator. And again, we have Klauserte, so the garden, all the elements of the garden have to weep, to cry on the death of the benefactor, of the dedicator. And in every occurrence we have Klauserte also in the beginning of the first, like in Lucilius 1 times. So why did Gregory take here this verb Klauserte, this very strong verb? I think there can be 2 reasons, and these reasons show what it means, a literary epigram, and what it means to be culturally dependent. As say the historians of emotions. Emotions change, connotations change. The first reason is the bucolic tradition, but because it's very clear that here are allusions made to Theocritus in the bucolic traditions and the motive of pathetic fallacy. You don't find the imperative Klauserte, but you find the verb kleien. Nature is weeping, kleien. On the other hand, my second idea is that Klauserte is a verb you find in the Septuaginta. It is in the translation of Old Testament, and there are psalms which are often cited by the church fathers and which were very well known, for example by Jeremiah, who just, I don't have the example here on the handout, who says, don't weep on this person which is dead, but weep on someone who has gone. This is very often cited by church fathers, and they use Klauserte. There's much weeping and crying in Ancient Testament, and I think perhaps it was that which stimulated. Yes, Gregory. Thank you, I've finished.